Paragraph 53 at 10 o'clock in the morning on August 19th, 1919. Paragraph 54 on September 3rd, 1919. Paragraph 55, which is the quote, I can predict with absolute certainty. Paragraph 56, 21 journalists traveled with Wilson on the train. And paragraph 57, in November, the Senate met to debate and vote on the ratification. To ratify something means to change something. So, 25-word summary. It goes on and it tells us, Wilson submitted the Versailles Treaty to the Senate in July of 1919. The election results in 1918 had brought a Republican majority to Congress, which meant that the Republicans could control the pace of debates. Many Republican senators, Lodge foremost among them, hoped to drag out the proceedings so that the public would become disengaged and would draw its support of the treaty. So they figured the longer that they could make them last, the more the public would just lose interest with it and they could do what they wanted. It goes on and it says, Senator Lodge began deliberations on the treaty by reading it out loud, which consumed 2 weeks. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee also had held public hearings for 6 weeks and another attempt to slow the process. So now we're 8 weeks in, so 2 months. During these hearings, American citizens were permitted to appear before the committee to voice their opinions of the treaty. Some spoke about the effect of the provisions of the treaty on their ethnic homeland, while others spoke about other segments of the treaty with which they were dissatisfied. Some believed these hearings represented an attempt to stir up opposition to the treaty from hyphenated Americans. Hyphenated meaning, even though we're all Americans, that they were still identified by their homelands. So Irish Americans, German Americans. We still use the term African Americans. So by hyphenating it means, yeah, we know you live here and you're Americans, but we're not viewing you as American as other groups and as other people. So it was very much used kind of as an insult and also to hold groups back and to kind of keep them at a lesser power. So again, if you look at that sentence, it says, some believe these hearings represented an attempt to stir up the opposition to the treaty from hyphenated Americans or recent immigrants or people who felt attachment to their ethnic homelands. At 10 o'clock in the morning on August 19th, 1919, members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee gathered with President Wilson in the East Room of the White House. Wilson perceived that enough opposition to the treaty existed in the Senate to prevent it from being ratified by the required 2/3 majority. During the meeting, he attempted to explain to the Covenant and the obligations of the United States under the League, hoping that he could persuade them to vote in favor of the ratification. The meeting lasted over 3 hours, but did nothing to sway the senators. Unable to convince the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of his views, Wilson opted to go on a nationwide trip where he hoped to explain the League of Nations to the American people and put pressure on doubting senators. On September 3rd, 1919, President Wilson set off on a whirlwind tour, giving 40 speeches in the space of 22 days. The itinerary of the trip had him traveling throughout the Midwest into California and then returning to Washington, D.C. via a southern route. As his train traveled through the country, the audiences grew to large numbers. They heard the constant speech about the values of Article 10 and the joining of the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson is quoted as saying, I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war if the nations of the world, if the League of Nations does not prevent it by concentrated actions. So pretty much he is already predicting World War II. If the League of Nations is not put into place and we're not a part of it, he feels that it won't be as powerful and there will be a second Great War, which at the time they didn't know, but obviously we know he was correct. Goes on and says 21 journalists traveled with Wilson on the train and ran daily stories of the trip. However, the pace of the trip, coupled with his pre-existing medical problems, proved to be too much for Wilson physically. On September 25th, 1919, Wilson gave his last speech in Pueblo, Colorado, before collapsing from physical exhaustion. His physician ordered the train back to Washington. 2 days later, on October 2nd, Wilson suffered a stroke. Incapacitated and partially paralyzed, Wilson was unable to continue his campaign to engage the American public on the Senate ratification debate. From his bed, Wilson sent notes to members of the Senate urging them to support the League. In November, the Senate met to debate and vote on the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and its controversial League of Nations, which made up the first 26 of 440 articles. The Senate had fallen into three distinct groups. One group supported the treaty as it stood. One group sought to make changes to it in order to maintain the power to act unilaterally in foreign affairs. And one group hoped to reject it altogether, preferring to isolate the United States from European issues. In the coming days, you'll have the opportunity to consider the range of options the Senate debated. And as we talked about in 3 months following the first vote, where we turned down the League of Nations, even with some changes made to it, it was still voted down to be ratified, and the ratifications were never accepted.